D.C. Ambassador, thank you for being here or there. And I know you have a big book out. I'm going to start with something you said in it. You're talking about the virus. You said Trump didn't want to hear warnings about the virus because he didn't want to hear bad things about President Xi of China that could affect the fantastic trade deal he was working on. Are you saying he botched the coronavirus response because he was protecting China?
Well, I think that's very substantially the case. I think in the critical early months, January, February, maybe even before that, there was an empty chair in the Oval Office. The experts around our government, on the NSC staff and the Centers for Disease Control and elsewhere, were raising the red flag. The president did not want to be bothered with it. He didn't want to hear about the cover-up, the outright deception that China was engaged in terms of the extent and the nature of the virus. And he particularly didn't want to hear anything that could foreshadow trouble for the American economy because of the disease that might upset his path to re-election. So there's a long list, and I won't repeat them all, but people can find it in online and in newspapers of statements Trump made, senior officials made, saying the virus is not a threat, we've got it under control, there won't be any impact. And that cost us a lot of time, and earlier steps could well have mitigated the effect of the disease substantially.
Okay, staying with China for a minute here. Twitter last week purged 174,000 accounts, fake accounts from the Chinese government. And of course, we know from the last election and what all our intelligence agencies told us that Russia was playing mischief, not only with social media, but also trying to directly hack into our election system. What did you, as National Security Advisor, do to protect us from this happening again?
Well, first, let me say, I think it's very clear that Russia and perhaps others did interfere in the 2016 election. I said before I joined the White House, I considered that to be an act of war against the Constitution, and I feel even more strongly today about it than I did then. Russia's been joined in the past couple of years by China, Iran, North Korea, probably others. Vice President Pence gave an important speech about China's effort, which focuses not simply on interfering in the elections, although that's obviously very disturbing, but on broader efforts to affect American public opinion. What we found in looking at our possible responses was that the U.S. government was bound up by a series of procedural rules, I won't get into the details, that made it very hard for the United States to conduct offensive cyber operations. My view, and I think the view widely shared in the government, was that the best defense against Russian attacks or Chinese attacks or anybody's attacks was to have our own offensive capability so that we could impose costs on those who tried to interfere with us, to the point where we could create structures of deterrence so that in Moscow and Beijing, they would say it costs us too much to interfere in American elections, we're going to back off. That battle goes on. Let there be no mistake. I think there are efforts to interfere even now in the election. And I think really what our adversaries want to do is disrupt America's institutions, sow mistrust among the American people. What we focus on, are they backing Trump? Are they backing somebody else? It's really the larger attack on our entire political system I think we should be looking at.
It is, but it's one party that's taking this help from foreigners. And you mentioned so many instances in your book of things that went on in the Trump administration, and you were critical of Bush in a big way in 2008 after he left office. You wrote something in the Wall Street Journal that was very critical, but that's a different story. Let's go to Trump. You say coddling of Kim made you ill, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, siding with Putin at Helsinki, abandoning the Kurds. You called the Ukrainian thing that got him impeached a drug deal. You didn't want any part of that. You were there when he said to Xi of China, people are talking about maybe repealing the law that says I can't only have 2 terms. And yet you won't vote for Biden. You say you won't vote for Trump, but you won't vote for Biden. How could Biden be worse? What could the Democrat be that you think this list could be surpassed by?
I think it's comparing apples and oranges. My objection to Joe Biden is philosophical, and it's important because this plays out in policies. I do think he'd be another 4 years of Obama national security policy. I think Trump presents an entirely different set of risks because I don't think he's competent to be president. I wish there were a conservative Republican that I could vote for who had a chance of winning, but there's not. My situation is that I live in Maryland, and my vote really doesn't mean that much one way or the other. So I'm going to do the best I can to show philosophically that I remain committed to these national security values that I've had for a long time.
But we only get two choices. We only have apples and oranges. There's only an apple and an orange on the ballot, and you have to pick one. And even if your vote doesn't count, your influence does.
Well, look, I faced this question in 2016, and I said to people who were saying I don't have to choose between them, I made exactly the arguments you made, and I voted for Trump on the ground that it's at least worth trying. That's really why I went into the administration. I thought I could make a contribution. I think what I've tried to do now is lay out 500 pages of facts about Donald Trump's performance, and they're there for anybody to use for whatever purpose they think fit. Obviously, Trump didn't want the book to come out at all and sued to stop it, but I view that as the contribution that I can make. And I'm going to be unstinting in my assessment of Trump as we get closer to the election. I'm not going to go out of my way to attack Biden because I think I'll leave that to him. But I do think what I'm going to focus on is keeping Republican control of the Senate, because if Biden does win, I think it's very important to make sure that Republicans hold at least one of the three elective entities.
Well, you took a lot of heat for not testifying in impeachment because you did call it a drug deal, and you did say if you were a senator, you would have voted for impeachment. So you were on the Democrats' side on that. But you said, and I think I agree with you here, you said even if you did testify, it wouldn't have changed the vote. I agree with that. But is the book going to change anybody's vote? I mean, by coming out with a book instead of testifying, you think that's more influential, that you have a book that says Donald Trump is a narcissistic dunce who sides with dictators? Didn't we know that?
Well, look, the book is the most detailed I could make it and still get through the government's pre-publication review process. I do think that while it may not have taken a village, it did take a book. I don't think, with all due respect, in a television interview or even in testimony in Congress, you can tell anything approaching the full story. I thought this was the best I could do. People will read it and make up their own minds. Many Republicans could read this book and vote for Trump anyway. I just want them to know what they're voting for.
Okay, you say that up to 10 times you tried to convince the president not to do what he was doing with Ukraine. In other words, he was withholding this vital aid that they needed until they came across with some dirt on Joe Biden. 10 times. So you obviously knew what was going on and how wrong it was, and you felt strongly about it. Somebody finally blew the whistle on that. We know, of course, there was a whistleblower. Why weren't you the whistleblower if you felt that way?
Well, it was 8 to 10 times that Mike Pompeo, Mark Esper, and I together or singly tried. It was the only people in the national security space in the administration who had any hesitation about giving this aid to Ukraine was Donald Trump himself. And we were focused on a very important operational question. This is going to sound bureaucratic, but the money was going to expire on September the 30th. If we didn't make that transfer as the days dwindled down, it could have just disappeared, and that would have harmed the United States. That's why we were focused on it. All of us ended up speaking with members of Congress, and I think what really persuaded Trump was not the whistleblower, but the political pressure, especially from Republicans on the Hill. And I recount in the book, that's not the first time that happened. It's very frequently it was the political pressure, not the national security arguments, that moved Trump to do what he did.
All right, well, I must say it's always a pleasure to read about what an asshole Donald Trump is. So I have enjoyed reading the parts of your book that I've read so far, and I thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.